This is what I show up for, dude. I like it when you're on top of it, dude. When you're on your A game. He takes a gazillion years to answer anything. What do you mean? If you ever do this again, Professor, do it like this. You said that you came here to get the 5 questions answered by somebody who's educated on this stuff. Why you would choose to not talk about a strain that could possibly answer your 5 questions is beyond me. We're going to go argumentative line to argumentative line and follow and kind of see where Destiny is missing answers or not accepting them, as well as what at a rhetorical level is causing Richard Wolff to fail so bad, you know, besides just saying the dude is long-winded or he takes forever to respond or he's confusing or he sounds like he's giving a lecture. Like, let's actually dig into that and have the nuts and bolts necessary to have conversations about this debate. I feel the need to point out our usual disclaimers. I am operating on multiple viewings, okay? I've been able to see this much more than once. I benefited from pausing, okay? I can pause at any point. I can rewind. I can check things that I think I missed. These are opportunities and abilities that our debaters do not have, right? So it's important to remember that. When I'm doing this isn't to say that these people should have operated perfectly. It's not to say that they even should have operated perfectly. It's to give them advice and to give them a line-by-line review that could help them in future performances, right? I think Wolff needs more advice than Steven here, but Steven always is looking to improve, so I hope he gets something out of it as well. We will benefit from a line-by-line analysis because, again, even React dandies watching this, those people are not going line by line. Those people are not typing out the arguments and scrolling through their notes and reviewing it hours before that they have the debate or they do their review or their React dandy thing, right? This may appear that it's the same as those kinds of content, but it's important to remember the prep that went into this, right? It is much harder to do this and see these things in real time. I've said this already, but it bears repeating that these debaters, I don't expect them to be able to catch things like this. For this debate in particular, this hurts Wolff. So I think Wolff got hurt by not being able to have people look at his stuff line by line, as is evidenced by the opinions you guys have about Wolff coming out of a real-time viewing of the debate. We will point out moments when Destiny and the audience at large miss Wolff's points, but this doesn't mean that Wolff was successful. My hugest thing is that rhetoric matters, optics matters, how people wind up perceiving you matters, and it matters independently of the validity of your arguments, right? He comes off very pompous, he comes off very uppity, and he comes right out of the gate with an attitude against Steven that is probably unwarranted, right? So a lot of this hurts Wolff, though he's going to look better when we do this line by line. A line by line in my style reveals things that are not immediately apparent to debaters at the time, but part of the benefit of my analysis is pointing those things out. Take these issues with a proper grain of salt, since while the debaters can learn from this, it doesn't mean it should have been easy or clear to them in the moment.
In the 3 minutes I have, I cannot speak as fast as you just did, so I won't even try. I'll try to make a couple of basic points. Every economic system in the history of the world displays the following pattern. It is born, it evolves over time, and then it dies and passes away, giving way to another one. And part of that process has always been the conviction of the people in each economic system that sooner or later they can, they should, and they will do better, overcome some of the problems and difficulties they're facing, and organize a system that better meets human needs. The process is sometimes relatively smooth, other times it's rocky. That varies with the conditions and particularly with the level of resistance from those who don't want to see the system change and shift. Capitalism, in my judgment, has been born, most would agree, has evolved over the last 3 centuries or so, and is now at that last stage. The only question now is exactly how and when the passing occurs. Likewise, in my judgment, the yearning for something better has built up in capitalism to a pretty intense level now. Whether you look at the debts of students, whether you look at the mind-bending inequality that this system generates over and over again, unless and until it is revolted against by masses of people who do something about the inequality, only to discover that as long as capitalism remains, the tendency to inequality resumes. I think people are also tired of the instability. Every 4 to 7 years, capitalism crashes. We've had 3 in this new century in its 20 years. Yep, right on schedule, every 4 to 7 years. Millions lose their jobs, businesses go belly up, cities and towns can't get the revenue they need to provide the services we depend on. One sign of the exhaustion of this system, a level of money creation, a level of debt creation we have never seen. Government debt, corporate debt, personal debt. The system is exhausted, and the entire private enterprise system is now on 24/7 government life support. I think it's over. I think that's difficult for us all to live through. And we better learn some lessons from the British Empire, from which they have been tumbling for a century. We could and should do better on the downswing than the British have been able to. And the more we talk about it and discuss it and explore it, the better our chances to make another progressive transition to a better system that we all need and will benefit from.
Okay, Destiny?
Oof, are you keeping us on a timer?
I am.
All right. As of March 2021, Americans rank the economy, job markets, the handling of the coronavirus, and leadership in Washington as the 4 most important challenges facing our country. Socialist policies would not alleviate any of these concerns. Countries have tried the socialist experiment. Time and time again, this has failed. Doctors in Cuba moonlight as taxi drivers. Countries with socialized healthcare haven't fared much better than the U.S. in their handling of the coronavirus. And any socialist regime will necessarily involve the bureaucracy of Washington even more heavily in our economy. Any country that has attempted to realize a fully socialist economy has either failed completely, such as in the case of the USSR, destroyed large swaths of their economy, such as in Venezuela, or been forced to embrace more neoliberal economic policies to realize true growth in their economy, such as in China or Vietnam. Liberal market policies work better in both theory and practice when it comes to efficiently allocating resources to maximizing the economic productivity of any country, and we've seen this play out time and time again across a wide variety of markets and countries throughout history across the globe. Oftentimes, people like Richard Wolff will bring up the boom-bust cycle as though it's an inherent flaw of capitalism, but I believe I speak for most when I say that a boom-bust cycle is preferable to just going bust, as so many socialist countries have. It's also important for us to realize that no economic organization is in and of itself inherently moral or immoral, but rather we ought to view them as tools to effect some greater output for our country that we can later utilize and distribute in the most fair manner with government policy to most of our citizens as we see fit, creating a bigger pie, so to speak, from which all of us can eat. Morality and justice should exist in the realm of government policy. We cannot allow it to blind us to the economic realities surrounding us. No matter how much we wish a wild lion not to eat us, our desire alone will never satiate its appetite. While socialism may sound good in theory, the destruction it would wrought on the wealth of our country and the oppressive restrictions it would place on our businesses would not help the vast majority of Americans. It'd be foolish to enforce protectionist or socialist policies on our economy while major developing economies, such as India and China, are moving in the exact opposite direction, having realized time and time again the failures in socialist planning. Socialism implies 2 major things: a change in both the means and mode of production. The means of production change in such a way to completely disallow private investment or ownership, and a change in the mode of production such that we no longer produce goods and services for a profit. Instead, businesses are only started with the approval of some governmental body, some kind of central planning, with the equal decision-making and management of every worker, and the goods and services produced in any society are what some government body dictates, irrespective of market forces or the wants and desires of the citizens. It's likely in the course of this debate that my opponent will suggest we take after Nordic or Western European countries, citing that things like socialized healthcare or subsidized education are powerful programs that address many of the underserved needs of Americans today. While this is true, I would like to remind everyone that we've spent the last decade reminding conservatives that the government simply providing welfare has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. My opponent believes that strong social safety nets and welfare programs are important parts of the government. Most liberals would welcome him with open arms, me included. Consequently, there are 5 major hurdles that no socialist I have ever spoken to has adequately addressed, and they are as follows. follows. Number 1, what level of violence is acceptable for you to reach our socialist state? Number 2, how do we decide which businesses are allowed to exist in a socialist society without allowing private capital investment? 3, is any form of investment whatsoever allowed in a socialist society for an expansion of business? 4, how are labor markets determined in a socialist society? And 5, how do we calculate which goods and services a nation needs if we do away with the commodity form?
He packs a lot into his opening statement, and he speaks very, very quickly. This was the most that I could boil it down to. But notice how Wolf took a similar amount of time, and yet we really only have these points that were important there. The rhetorical failure from Wolf is going to be that he's long-winded. He includes things that are often irrelevant or are repeated, and he's also trying to sprinkle in things to inspire in people a kind of drive to go look at his other content, to look more into these things, right? So when he's talking about something like a boom-bust cycle, it almost seems like he's talking to somebody that maybe doesn't even know that that exists within the capitalistic system. So he's trying to here kind of open people's eyes to these other things and get them to read his other shit.
I find this a laughable caricature of anything I've ever written or anything that I understand is part of this conversation. And I don't appreciate being told what I think or what I say or what I mean or what I intend. I can speak for myself, and that would just be fine if we could allow each other to do that.
Wolf is going to come out of the gate upset that Stephen said that he believes in things that were not mentioned within his opening statement. Number 1, this Wolf likes social safety nets thing was said here, and it was said just before this welfare point here. So Stephen is already attributing beliefs that Wolf has that, now, mind you, he did research before this, so these may be things that Wolf has said in other conversations, but one thing, whether it frustrates you or not, about the Booksmarts debate reviews is that I try to keep them condensed only to the debate. The only thing outside of this that I have watched of Wolf was the Gravel Institute video that he did about China. The only reason that I looked at that is because Stephen explicitly references it here, so I felt it was important to watch that. We try to look at things in the context of this conversation. People that are going to be in the middle or unswayed are probably going to be people that were not watching in DGG, did not see Destiny's Prep, do not know about Richard Wolff, so they're going to make their opinions based on only what happens in the debate, right? So this right out of the get-go is something that Wolff doesn't say, so he's going to get frustrated at that. That does not mean that I think that his frustration is warranted to the extent that he communicates it. Coming right out of the gate with an attitude is something that a lot of people pointed out as making him unpalatable to them, right? You have this professor that's above this dude, and he's in a conversation with him for the first time, and the first thing that he chooses to communicate to the audience after giving his intro is a bunch of aggression towards the other guy, right? Even if he thinks that Stephen said things that he didn't say or he doesn't believe in, I don't think that that should have been his focus right out of the gate with this intro. There are many, many other things he could have focused on. For instance, Stephen giving his definition of socialism, which in my opinion would cover a lot. It would cover all three strains and then some, right? So maybe the move for him right after this intro was not to focus on the words that Stephen put in his mouth, but rather to focus on other points that Stephen gave in the intro that could move the conversation forward. I'm going to give these kinds of criticisms for Stephen too, not moving the conversation forward and focusing on the wrong things, and I'm going to give them to Wolff as well.
I have no idea what this silly remark that I hear so often is, that no socialist society has succeeded at anything. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you an example. One of the most important metrics used in the economics profession around the world to assess the quote-unquote success of an economic system is the rate of economic growth. You measure GDP and you look at how it grows over time. And then you compare one country to another to assess their relative success, not as societies, because that's a vague generality, but at this particular metric, which we use in economics to measure economic growth over time. It's not the only metric, but it's a widely used one. So I'm now going to use it. In the 20th century, the fastest growing metric, the fastest growing GDP in any country measured was the Soviet Union. And in the 21st century we're living in, the fastest growing GDP in the world has been the People's Republic of China. This is not an endorsement of one or another economic system. It's a statement of fact verified by any reliable source of information. The UN, the projects in the University of California, Berkeley, and others who keep track of this.
What will kind of make clear, looking at the notes on your screen and then comparing them to what's being said, is how much of what he's saying is kind of context, nuance, kind of what I will call fluff, because unfortunately it hurts him rhetorically. These explanations about like what GDP is, things like this, they can come off as if he's treating Stephen as he's uneducated, as if he's speaking to the audience, which is something that Stephen and his audience criticizes Vosh for doing, for instance. So I think that you're taking a rhetorical gamble by spending so much time explaining these things, using that many words when you speak very, very slowly. And I think that speaking slowly is something that you want to consider as a debater to be something you need to work around or work into your strategy in much the same way that Stephen speaks very fast, and he needs to consider that in his debate strategy. If Stephen is trying to be as precise as possible and tries to speak in bullet notes, the fact that he has like 50 bullets per second or whatever that he's able to get through means that that's probably not the best strat for him, right? He needs to, make sure that he's speaking for long enough on each bullet that people can kind of have time to process and understand how one bullet point is going to relate to the next bullet point. Whereas for Wolf, we have the opposite problem. He speaks very, very slowly. And the fact that he has so much fluff and explanation with every single point that he's trying to bring up, this means that we're hanging on for a very long time to figure out what it is that he's saying, or how it's going to connect to the next thing, or how it relates at all to anything that's being asked of him, which will come up later. So this problem in pacing is something that you'll see clear as we're going through these notes and comparing what is important and what actually works into the conversation versus how much time is being spent and on what, right? I said fluff in quotation marks mostly because I don't think this is fluff. I think this is explanation that in a paper would be fine to have there, and it would not be considered fluff. But like I said with Jangles, you're not writing an essay. If you prepare a debate statement or you treat a debate as if you are writing papers, it is not going to work, because the fact of the matter is that things like talk time are very important in a way that you don't need to think about them in papers. Explanations and things like this are best removed in conversation with people if you can assume that the other person knows, for instance, vaguely what GDP is. I don't think these things need to be explained, and wasting that much time explaining them means that people are going to start tuning out more and more every single time you start talking, or they're going to write you off and assume that they know everything that you're talking about because you have no discretion in which topics and which ideas you're choosing to explain. Later, we start talking about things that seem unique to Wolf's perspective and Wolf's beliefs about socialism, capitalism, markets, and the world. People have been trained to tune him out on these explanations, presuming that there is no context there, which is helpful, or no explanations that they need because they simply can take for granted that they understand everything he's going to say and that he's simply going to ramble about some shit that they already know, right? So he trains the audience to do this in the very, very beginning, and it doesn't work out for him, setting aside what we talked about earlier with setting the tone so negatively right out of the gate, right?
In much of the world, economic growth is a shared objective and goal that these two societies have excelled at achieving, number one. Number two, when it comes to socialism, it would be useful if we all understood what the word means rather than playing around with caricatures. For example, the notion that socialism is all about what the government does has been contested throughout the history of socialism. And that idea is less dominant within the socialist tradition now than it ever was over the last 150 years.
So one of the claims that Stephen makes at the end of the debate and in his kind of review of the entire debate is that Wolf is just like every other socialist who seems to think that socialism is when the government does things. That's not correct. Wolf explicitly says that that's not what he believes, right? That's important to note because he's also going to combine that in the same point and say that modern thinking is not that anymore. That a lot of the modern thinkers have branched off from this and think of it in different ways. Hence, the three strains that we will talk about later that view the government in its relationship to socialist policies very different. How does the government play into things, right? He says this right in the very beginning. His first statement after the intros, right? So just bear this in mind. I don't want to see this anymore. Stop saying this, because he says the exact opposite in his first statement. Okay, so like, let's not say that. Let's say his three strains were confusing. Let's say he should have focused more on the strain he believes in. Let's say strain 1 is vacuous. Let's say those things, but let's not say that Wolf believes that socialism is about what the government does and the socialism is when the government does things, because that's frankly incorrect. And he makes that clear from the very, very beginning, okay?
Today, one of the most important issues for socialists has to do not with government regulation, not with government owning and operating businesses, not with these bugaboos of bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but has to do with an objective of transforming the organization of production. In a factory, in an office, in a store, not to have a small group of people, the owner, the board of directors, the tiny little minority at the top that is a dictatorial power inside an enterprise, making all the key decisions that the employees have to live with, even though the minority making those decisions is not accountable to those employees. That's a socialism of transformation at the micro level, about which very little could have been discerned in the comments preceding these. If we're going to talk about socialism, then we have to talk about what it means to the people pushing for it and urging it. And those people have learned from the 20th and 21st century, just like those who pushed for capitalism 3 centuries ago learned from their early experiments how to refine, how to adjust, and how to change. To pretend that that didn't happen, to trade in old and shrinking conceptions of socialism may be good debating ploy, but it doesn't advance our understanding of anything.
Wolf has some rhetorical quips that he likes to throw in on statements like, oh, I'm so tempted to do a Bernie voice. Can I do a Bernie voice?
We can't stick to the old ideas, okay? This isn't Marxism. This isn't, whatever.
When he's saying that kind of shit, he's giving these little quips at Destiny, and I don't think they work for him because tonally these all add up to making him look like an asshole, right? And I get where he's going with it, and it is how debates work on Twitch, but it doesn't really work out for him, especially when he's cooking those in, and Steven's not going to have the opportunity to respond to them all the time because he's allowed to just ramble and ramble and ramble. So this is a habit that he gets into that I think is really negative for him. And if he really wants people to perceive him as a professor, to kind of bank on that ethos as he does later when he's clearly wrong about things, I think that it would serve him better to not have those kinds of quips in there, because I really don't think they help him optically. They may help other debate bro people, but other debate bro people are uneducated dipshits that have nothing else to rely upon other than their quips and their quick humor, right? So they're banking 100% on what few things are good about them, and those few things include being quick-witted. But you most certainly are not quick, and you most certainly are not witty, sir. So you need to focus on your education, on your professional background, and you need to move per the pace of what you're, putting out there in the conversation, not to be giving these quips like that. I don't think that works out well for you.
If you want, it'd be easier to have more of a back and forth rather than the super long monologues each, so we can respond to each other more, if you're okay with that. Just for a couple of things that you said. So I'm trying not to miss...
I just talk slower than you.
Oh, yeah, no, it's fine. My understanding is that in the 20th century, there was a faster growing economy than the USSR, and it was Japan. Japan still exists today, and the USSR does not. I understand that the USSR did show a huge amount of growth, but I think it's odd to use that as an example when socialists often point to the evils of imperialism, and when you point out the fact that everybody was heavily industrializing around that time as well. I don't think it's fair to say that the USSR simply grew on the merits of socialism when there were so many other things happening at the time, and when it was outgrown by another economy that was...
But those are the facts. I mean, you can play whatever games you want. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union's performance in the 20th century completely outshines that of Japan. There's no comparison.
This is going to be the first, and we're going to start setting a pattern here of Wolf interrupting Stephen and getting away with it. And that's why I have included in the notes these periods and markers for when interruptions are happening versus natural like movements in the conversation, natural kind of transitions between the speakers. So here, this kind of like attacking this when Stephen had admitted here that the USSR had huge growth, like he admitted that the USSR had huge growth. He said that actually Japan was faster. The question here should have been about the numbers here. When in the 20th century are we looking, and maybe not saying that this is a fact and, you know, you could say it any way that you want, but, you know, that wasn't the way to handle it. The way to handle it would have been like setting aside the Japan thing. Who cares if Japan was faster? Laying out the points that you already wanted to lay out about the hardships that the USSR faced and doing that. Although you're probably not going to win that because Japan had some hardships too, and they grew fine. And a lot of the hardships in the USSR are in part coming from their government and the decisions that they're making. So I don't know about anything that comes after this, but this like jumping in with, oh, that's a fact. And even if it doesn't work out for you, you know, like I don't think that's working out super well rhetorically for him. Steven's going to learn right here that Wolf is going to be able to interrupt, get a million more points off and whatever. And then down here, he is going to deny Wolf the interruption after he learned that Wolf is going to interrupt. And if he successfully interrupts, he's going to get a gazillion points off that don't really move things forward. So when Destiny gives his next statement, he's going to stop Wolf from interrupting, right? And that's why, is because Wolf interrupts here and he's very, very successful at it. And Steven knows that it's going to hurt him if he lets Wolf keep doing that.
In 1917, when the Soviet Union begins, it is the poorest country in Europe by far. It then goes through 70 years of a lost World War I, of a civil war, of an agricultural collectivization, and of World War II, which did more damage in Russia than in any other country. Notwithstanding that it was the poorest country at the beginning of this horrific story, it ends up in 1965 being the #1 competitor of the United States for global hegemony. That's only because of its #1 status in economic growth that it achieved the overcoming of all those horrific losses. I'm not arguing in favor of this or that about the Soviet Union, but the fact of its achievement is a staggering reality that you can dance around from here to tomorrow, but it doesn't go away because it's inconvenient to confront it. And the same thing is true now. If you read Pearl Buck's novels about China before the revolution, you will hear about a society whose depth of poverty literally blows your mind.
This is not good. Don't be referencing these books, Professor, because that's not how these Twitch audiences work. And they're going to just think that you're being brainy and that you don't actually want to explain things. That does not help. Remember when we talked about how other groups don't necessarily want to win the debate. They want to give you sprinkles so that you go and look up these ideas and books and different things and then educate yourself on them on your own. That may be Wolf's objective here. And if it is, then I think you need to play things out differently and lean into that, because the balance that you're trying to strike between performing well in the debate while also leaving all of these little breadcrumbs, I think is not working for you, in my personal opinion, and based on the response of the audience. Yeah, I would discourage things like this. Don't be mentioning books and stuff like that. It just does not work very well.
Here they are about to surpass the United States before the end of this decade. And that was accomplished by a communist revolution and a government that has been run by a communist party to this day. And yeah, for sure, they cleverly opened their society up to capitalists to come and join them. But to imagine that the achievement of the Chinese economy is purely due to the private capitalists rather than to the state economy, that's making believe, because you need to have an argument that puts the success at the credit of one or the other. The infrastructure, the training of the mass of people, everything that happened in China is as much a product of the planning and policies of the communist government than of any other factor. And that has to be recognized as well. And none of this is an endorsement. That society has strengths and weaknesses. It has things we can criticize, but we can't make it up because it's inconvenient to face the successes they've had and continue to have.
Okay, so I'm not saying that the USSR did not grow a lot. Obviously, the USSR grew massively.
Now, unfortunately, Stephen has to repeat that.
I understand that the USSR did show a huge amount of growth, but I think it's odd.
Remember that Stephen had already said that here. Stephen admitted off the bat that they had huge growth, and then he was interrupted before he could complete his point that he's actually going to be able to complete here.
Your claim is not that the USSR grew. That's not what we're arguing about. It's whether or not the USSR grew at the rate that it did due to socialism. A country that was heavily involved in multiple famines, a country that heavily went from little industrialization to a lot of industrialization, and a country that engaged in a lot of imperialistic practices is a country that grew massively in the 20th century. To say that all of their growth, or even the majority of their growth, was due to the organization of their economy and not due to factors that were independent of that organization, to say otherwise that they wouldn't have grown, maybe at an even faster rate, had they been a capitalist economy, there would have to be some evidence provided for that. And I don't believe that that's ever been adequately demonstrated. On the contrary, I believe some people have argued that Russia could have potentially grown, the USSR could have potentially grown even faster had it abandoned some of its more outdated forms of trying to manage their economy. When we bring up China, China has grown a lot under certain socialist policies for sure. But when we look at China, especially in the 80s and 90s, China began opening itself up to massive growth when it comes to foreign investment. China is the number 2 country in the world that allows for foreign direct investment. And the coalescing of all of China's state-owned, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, into a select few industries, and then the massive opening of foreign investment into that country to give other people more control over privately owned businesses has been what has caused the massive explosion that we've seen of China in terms of pulling people out of global poverty, as you mentioned in the video that you did for the Gravel Institute. You attribute that to socialist policies, but the thing that really pulled China into the 21st century in terms of economic success was the opening itself up to foreign direct investment, was the opening itself up to other economies being able to interact with them more, which are all neoliberal trade policies. These aren't people-owned businesses. These aren't businesses that are ran by the workers. These are, I mean, if anything, China is a government that runs the business itself. It's a state capitalist economy more so than any type of socialist or communist economy. To say that a single party regime is having the workers themselves making decisions over how any individual business is running, I don't think is fair to say.
Stephen has learned not to let this dude interrupt him all the time. So here, Wolf is going to try to interrupt with China understanding being flawed, and he's going to fail.
I guess one of the, and then real quick, just finishing.
Your understanding of China... Your understanding of China, though, is really badly flawed.
Can I finish this last part?
I love it. I love it. If you guys remember, in the conversation that Vosh had with Mel, Vosh was being an asshole. His tone was that of an asshole. He talked over her. He didn't let her answer questions. He put words in her mouth, yada, 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 okay? So he's totally beating on Mel, rhetorically, verbally, and Mel goes on the back foot. Mel starts to take this tone of being attacked, right? To kind of match it, right? And Mel points out that this isn't very good faith from Vosh, all these other things. Mel basically does the best that she can being in that situation. I don't like Mel, okay? I'll put that out there in case you don't know me very well. Kind of similar to what's happening there stylistically, we have the same here. If Destiny is going to be interrupted and he wants to challenge that interruption, he's able to get the best of both worlds here. He is able to challenge the interruption and succeed, while at the same time being able to do it in a tone that makes him look like he is being wrongfully stepped over by this professor guy. That this is the second time now that he's interrupting Stephen in the middle of his statement, yet Stephen lets the dude go on and on and on until there's a natural pause and then jump in. But the fact that he's trying to jump on top of him and Stephen takes a sort of tone, I think works out really, really well for him.
The thing that confuses me the most, and the thing that frustrates me the most, I guess, when I have discussions with socialists, is socialism feels like this very amorphous, ever-transforming idea of what it actually is, such that I don't even know why we use the word anymore. So I'm very glad that you've acknowledged that Marx, through his labor theory value analysis, was absolutely flawed and was an absolute failure. I'm glad that you've acknowledged that the way of analyzing...
I have not acknowledged... You're making this stuff up. I've never acknowledged anything of the word.
Okay, well,
so it's worth pointing out that, Wolf is going to do an interruption here, and to be fair to him, he didn't say that. They'll kind of hash out why Stephen believes that was what was said, but it most certainly is not. If we know anything about Wolf, we know that he's the king of nuance to the point of being maybe vacuous and vague. And if that's the case, we most certainly can't pin him on statements like this. It's not going to work, right? This is something stylistically that Stephen does in other conversations where it works out better when it's not pointed out or it's not refuted like well enough, and when somebody's not going to get to go on for forever and ever and ever responding to it. But in this particular conversation, doing things like that, I think are going to look bad, and I don't think it works very well. Somebody had mentioned earlier that Wolf had done this with Stephen. But if Stephen doesn't point it out, there's not much of a cost to it in the same way that there is, using it against Wolf, because you used it against Wolf and he points it out or tries to interrupt or says that you're purposefully misunderstanding him. It's almost like he's building a case for why he should be treating you this way, for why he should be treating you with bad faith gloves on, right? So I would be careful with this. And to be fair to Stephen, he tries to be more careful with this from this point onwards.
Well, earlier you just said that we shouldn't hold ourselves captive to the thinking of thinkers in the 19th century in terms of what socialism is. So I assume you've evolved
No, I didn't do that at all. I told you that socialism has a variety of theories within it. It's a broad tradition. It had to be. In the 150 years since Marx wrote, his ideas have moved into every country on this earth at different levels of economic and cultural and political life. And of course, those different people all found something valuable, but they all made their own interpretations. This is a rich, diverse tradition. It's as if you're going to decide what it is I mean when I say these things.
To be fair to Stephen here, that's how debates work, sir. You're going to say things and I have to get from what you're saying more than what you're actually saying. And if I get that wrong, then feel free to point it out. But that's how human conversation works, Professor. You're going to say things and people are going to take it to be one way or the other. They're going to take even more than just the words at their face value. Again, this is not an essay, Professor. This is not you writing a report. This is not you giving a lecture. You're in a debate and a conversation with other people, so you need to treat it as such. And if you keep fighting against that, as you do throughout this conversation, you're going to get increasingly frustrated about that. And I think that you waste time, energy, and frankly, at a rhetorical expense, you are doing these things. I don't think it's helping you a lot.
Can you when you say
something? Wait a minute. I want to correct something about China because you keep repeating it.
Okay.
You know why private enterprise?
This dejected okay. I know that some people might think it makes Stephen look weak or whatever, but remember, the same way that we're giving weight to the professor's kind of ethos as a professor and as somebody who has been a studied man and all this stuff, Stephen has a history of being the loud, obnoxious, kind of aggressive dude. And so for him to take these kinds of, passive little statements and whatever, in my opinion, these are all adding up to help him, and they're adding up to make the professor and his actions look worse in the same way it did in that Mel and Vosh conversation. So I like this at a rhetorical level, but I get that you guys as viewers of his may not.
You know why private enterprise and private capital flows into China in the 80s and 90s? Because China had transformed itself from a place where nobody wanted to invest to a place like now where everybody does. Capitalist enterprises went there because they had a well-educated, disciplined labor force at very low wages, because they had built an extraordinary infrastructure because you had a growing level of income for people to buy things. That's why General Motors produces and sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The reason private capital went there was because they had, before the arrival, created the institutions. Every other part of the so-called third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had received since the Second World War massive amounts of foreign aid, were desperately trying to do what the Chinese were doing, namely, develop their countries so that foreign private investment would come. China didn't get any foreign aid because they were communists and the United States didn't give them any. But they did a better job than all the countries who did get it in order to get to the point of economic development where it became interesting for capitalists in Japan and Europe to go there. You need to pretend, for reasons I do not understand, that all of the achievements I've just described didn't happen, that somehow they don't deserve the credit. Look, in the world of economics, perhaps you're not familiar, we do exactly what you just said we oughtn't to do.
We got a 2-for-1 on some rhetorical slights here. So this pretending these didn't happen for whatever reason, who knows what the reason could be? Come on, Professor. We know what you're doing here. And frankly, like, you're not coming off well, especially when you're combining it with that little quip that you did right after. This is why people felt like the professor came off tonally as very, very aggressive right out of the gate. It's not just that he has all these quips. It is significant to bear in mind that all of these quips and these like remarks that he's doing are in contrast to Stephen. They're all contrasted by the tone that I was talking about in stepping off of interruptions and things like that, or successfully getting, the stop on an interruption with a tone that is more submissive, right? That tone clashing with the professor's tone here, I think had a huge optical influence on the audience right out of the gate, and it left a sour taste in their mouth about the professor. So even when Stephen acting later very aggressively, it's not hurting him. It's not hurting him to act aggressively later because he was so patient and so calm in the very beginning and got interrupted all the time and got spoken over and all of that. So he kind of built up this rhetorical credit that he cashes in at the end. We kind of feel okay that Stephen acted rambunctious at the end because it almost feels deserved given how the professor treated him at the beginning of the conversation. Comments like, I'm not sure if you even understand economics or whatever, like these are starting to paint the picture that the professor thinks very lowly of Stephen. And if you're an audience member that feels like you're on board with Stephen's arguments and what he's saying here, then of course you're going to feel like you were also personally attacked by that kind of comment. The professor at a stylistic level should lay off of that shit because he's hurting other people in the crossfires of that. And he's hurting the very people that he hopes will listen to his case here, look at these books, watch his lectures, etc. So like, I think he needs to be more careful about that.
We look at societies and say, they have a capitalist economic system. How did they do? And they have a socialist system with the different meanings of that term. And how did they do? And then we say they're different and part, not all, part of the story is the different system. And if I say to you that the socialist tradition has multiple interpretations, let me assure you that the capitalist tradition does as well. The leaders of Saudi Arabia right now call themselves capitalists.
Can I ask you, when you say socialist, what do you mean when you say socialist then? I'm trying to understand what this means.
We're going to kind of really focus in on the definitions from this point on. I think this is a conversation where it is important to flesh that out. Now, you may think that the onus was on the professor to have done that earlier. Fair. Stephen took the incentive here or whatever. He kind of jumped ahead of it and did that. And I think that's good. So let's focus on the definitions here. Let's see if we could hash those out.
Can you give me like a cohesive, coherent?
That's good. No, let me answer. They're a variety. I'll give you 3 basic strains right now. They don't exhaust it, but they enable us to have a conversation. One strain. You leave enterprises in the hands of private capitalists. but you recognize that the capitalist system is so flawed, for example, in terms of inequality, in terms of business cycle instability, that you give a role to the government of massive intervention, rules, regulations, laws. You know, let me give you some examples.
Given that you're long-winded, I think that it's best that you try to avoid the example thing with literally every single thing that you said. Like, the reason why Destiny's interruption worked, and I don't even really fault him for it, is because you were starting to talk about how Saudi Arabia thinks this and that. Like, while that may work well in a lecture, it doesn't really work well in conversation. You're just hogging the mic for a very, very long time when you do that. And if anything, you need to keep in mind that the human brain has its own equivalent of RAM, a limited amount of information it can hold in its frame of mind at once. It may be difficult for me to remember your definition when 2/3 of your explanation of a definition was an example that you gave. It may not stick with me what the basic bullet point was here when you spend a bunch of time on examples. You're distracting from your point. So in my opinion, a way to improve here would be to use less examples. If examples are necessary, your interlocutor will make that clear. You don't need to include them with every single explanation that you give. That hurts you later with the feudalism and other points as well. So bear in mind that those are coming at a cost for you.
In France, it's the law that once you begin working after graduating from high school or college, every employer has to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation from the beginning. Nothing like that exists in the United States. But this is a society that won that for its people, by the way, by socialists who did that, and put that on the books, as it is on most European countries. And socialists do that because they believe for them that socialism is when the government comes in and regulates. That's one kind.
And notice how he's packed in that definition that Stephen gave, where socialism is the government doing stuff, into this number one. And given that Wolf said that he doesn't like that definition, and given that he said, like, in passing that, yeah, and then they give that stupid fucking definition on point number one here, it's clear to me, and it was clear to me even in my first viewing of this, that this is not one that he believes in, right? And that's going to be explicitly clear to us when he says that point number 3 is the one that he believes in. Definition or strain 3 is the one that he believes in. I think if I told him to rank these in terms of like which he likes the most to the least, I really would be tempted to say that he would put number 1 at the very bottom of that list, right? And number 3 obviously at the top because he mentions as much. So it doesn't seem like he's necessarily down for this, though he sees that it is in most of Europe, France, other countries like that. He sees a lot of it, but it's not necessarily the one that is his pet definition.
Second kind of socialist, they don't believe it works real well if you do that. It's not enough. So they want to take a different step. They want the government to come in and actually own and operate enterprises, not merely regulate them with rules and laws. Then there's a third kind, which I stressed a few moments ago, which is not about the government. Doesn't care all that much whether the government runs an enterprise or the private does. They can figure out, whichever one works better. Let's be real practical. But for them, what socialism means is the transformation of the everyday life of working people. No longer do you go to work with other people telling you what to do, where to sit, what machine to use, what raw material to work on. And at the end of the day, you go home and you've got nothing more to say about what you poured your brains and muscles into. No, no, no. For these socialists, like me, the crucial thing is to reorganize the workplace, to bring real democracy, can you believe it, to the place where we work. In a country that claims to be democratic, we don't have democracy in the workplace. We have a tiny group of people telling the majority what to do, fully unaccountable to that majority. You know, if we really believed in democracy, this kind of socialism argues, we would recognize that that's where adults spend most of their adult life, at work. And if you really believe in democracy, it should have been installed in the workplace. But capitalism doesn't permit that. The folks at the top want to keep the power to keep their inordinate wealth, even at the expense of no democracy and of a growth record inferior to what Russia did in the 20th century and what China is doing now. And that's an enormous price to pay.
This ignores Stephen's comments about capitalism leading to faster USSR growth. When he's saying this here, People are not doing this. Like, even though we look at countries like the USSR and China and we see that these were like the fastest growing places, like, you know, it would seem that if we wanted to grow the fastest, we might even pick this. But this is ignoring the comment that Stephen made earlier that some people even think that maybe Russia could have grown faster or the USSR could have grown faster had they just been capitalists in the first place.
To say otherwise, that they wouldn't have grown, maybe at an even faster rate had they been a capitalist economy.
I think he misses that here, and it shows that he's not necessarily listening to every point of Stephen's in much the same way that Stephen is not listening to every one of his points, which will be demonstrated later on.
Okay, so if you want to talk about the 2 and 3 definitions of socialism, that would be interesting to me, but I only heard 2 definitions of socialism here. Number 1 is just capitalism. I don't know when this like redefining happened of taking capitalism plus government intervention and calling it. Wait, well, let me finish. Right.
That denial is just so good, and you guys may not like him to be on that kind of like more timid tone, but man, does it work. Later, when you do interruptions, it comes off worse, but here it was really, really good.
I don't know why this was the case that state intervention into private markets to have some form of regulation or some form of socialized healthcare or giving workers 5 weeks off became socialism. It is clearly not socialism. It's so not socialism that I think Marx himself even said that the state would be heavily required in maintaining capitalism, more so than I guess even Marx was able to foresee, because he predicted a revolution of the proletariat in his lifetime. The idea that the state intervening and providing some sort of social welfare or safety net is that's just strictly a capitalist system with some government intervention. If we want to talk about the concept of the government owning and operating enterprises, or number 3, the idea is that the workers themselves have some like worker managed thing, I would be interested in discussing either of those 2 options, as I believe all 5 questions I laid out initially applied to them.
But I'm instead going to end my statement by asking you about the one that I completely disagree with, you don't agree with, and does not apply to my 5 questions at all.
For number 1, I wholly reject that as a form of as a form of socialism. If you believe it is, I'd be curious if you can tell me what is the difference between the first thing you laid out and any capitalist that acknowledges that some level of government intervention is necessary in keeping the economy going.
So the problem, Stephen, is that you know he's super long-winded, and if you hand the mic to him, he's going to use it for a very, very, very long time, even if it seems like a very simple question to answer. Now, this may be a hindsight thing, but it seems like you're aware of this in the moment. It was not good to ask this explicit question about socialist system number 1. If you identified that your 5 questions can apply to it and it's vacuous and it's silly, I would have hoped that you would have also picked up on his tone when he introduced definition number 1 and would have heard when he said number 3 is the one that he believes in, because this just was not the play here. Either you should have focused on strain number 3 and applied your 5 questions to that one or brought the conversation forward on that one, or you should have talked about how 2 and 3 could answer your 5 questions. But in no universe do I think it's smart to choose to go in the direction of strain number 1, rather than focus on what he knows will bring the conversation forward about the 5 questions that he mentions in his intro and actually showing some kind of care about getting those answered. He chooses to focus on strain 1. I'm harping on this and I keep repeating this because I feel like this was one of the biggest blunders from Stephen in this conversation. It may be a hindsight thing, but man, this ends up getting us way off track. You said that you came here to get the 5 questions answered by somebody who's educated on this stuff. So why you would choose to not talk about the strain that he actually believes in, why you would choose to not talk about a strain that could possibly answer your 5 questions is beyond me.
The history of socialism gets going in the middle of the 19th century. And at that time, socialists began to argue that capitalism was over, capitalism was done, and a better system was available and should be pursued. And they had a whole bunch of ideas about that. They were a relatively small group. If you know the history of Marx and Marxism, it begins relatively small. As the 19th century progresses, it gets larger and larger. And guess what happens when that movement gets larger? Debates begin to happen inside of it as to what in the world capitalism is and what in the world socialism is. And here we go. Some of the people decided that socialism as a radically alternative system wasn't in the cards. Could never happen in some views, could only happen in a distant future.
This is the key that the audience members miss out on. The reason that he has to explain this, the reason that he gives this history, is to explain the branching of different ideas, different thoughts on socialism. Those people that did not believe that socialism was possible, whether in their lifetime or in the foreseeable future, decided to resign themselves to living under a capitalist system and instead chose how they could make things better, given that they have to live in that capitalist system. What we end up seeing here is that those people basically resign themselves to whatever is possible under that system. Well, what do we have? Well, we have a government. So we're going to try to go for universal suffrage, and we're going to use the government as a tool for regulations and policies that we think benefit all these people or get us as close as we could possibly get to this thing, while not deluding ourselves into thinking it's possible that we ever achieve it in its purest form. But those people are limited because of that philosophical belief about the potential of socialism in a way that Strain 2 and Strain 3 are not. Strain 2 believes that it is possible to have something close to an approximation of socialism by having full government control, by having the government own things, right? If the government is a tool to enact things that get us closer and closer to this socialist utopia or this socialist ideal, then would it not then make sense to use the government to also be the owner instead of private people, and that the government that is implementing these policies should be the same government that is also in control of and making some decisions about how all these companies function at a larger level for the people and for the workers? Then the people that look at number 3 are completely different, but we talk about them very little because we don't focus on the one that Wolf believes in for some apparent reason. Why do you think so many people miss that background info being important? Because it happens very quickly and he's very long-winded, and like I said, he kind of trains people not to listen to him at the very beginning with over-explaining things like GDP. It could be a mix of a lot of things.
What then did socialists do in the meanwhile before a real change of system happened? Answer: advocate for the government to be taken over by universal suffrage. The mass of people would institute a socialism that was, if you like, a step in that direction. An early socialism, if you like. And by the way, there were big debates, pro and con, within the socialist movement about this. But they settled to understand, let's call it one kind of socialism. And that's what you have in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, to this day. Socialist parties advocate that, and the people in that society often vote those folks into power. I'll give you an example. The government in Portugal right now, a perfect example, European country. The government of Portugal is a coalition of 3 political parties. The largest is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second one is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. They were elected as a coalition government in 2016. They were re-elected last year. Parenthetically, if your audience members don't know about this, that's because you live in a society that doesn't tell you about this, even though it's public knowledge to anyone interested in finding out.
Yeah, the American government wouldn't want to tell you this, but actually Portugal's got a lot of fucking socialist and communist parties, and fucking America doesn't want you to know. They don't want you to know socialist revolutions are happening all over the country. There are whole socialist countries out there.
He's got secret info, dude, and he wants you to go look it up for yourself.
Those parties push a socialist agenda by which they mean government rules and regulations. You may not like to call it socialists, but the people involved, and millions of them around the world, do. The other kind of socialism broke away from this first kind in the aftermath of the Soviet Revolution. They were in favor of taking that extra step. Socialism for them meant that the government should take over and operate enterprises, at least the industrial ones, maybe later the agricultural ones. And to underscore their distinction from the other socialists who just wanted government rules, regulations, and controls, they gave themselves the name communist. And that's the only difference between them. And it has been that way for nearly a century now, since the Russian Revolution.
And-
And then there's this third one, which has to do with transforming the workplace. Those are all socialisms. They argue, they debate, they have a rich literature. We have lots of empirical examples of all three kinds in the world. And if people want to think about how they work and what kind of society they produce, there's loads of evidence there. We don't have to hypothesize or pretend or demonize either, because really it doesn't lend itself to that if you're serious.
Okay, first of all, just because a government calls itself socialist, I don't think that that's adequate to define said government as socialist.
I'll be honest, we get a bit debate bro-y here. We can just as easily move past this onto strain 3, his beliefs, or strain 2 and 3 to get through your 5 questions. But instead, we're going to do this.
What would you consider, like, for instance, like the Nazi Party? Would you consider that a socialist party as they have socialism in the name? It doesn't seem like a good...
No. But
Why not?
The minute you know anything about the Nazi Party, you'd understand that.
Would you say that Portugal is Portugal a socialist economy? Or do they have markets? Do they have private investment?
Markets have nothing to do with socialism.
Okay, can you tell me what is your definition of capitalism then? Because when I ask you what is socialism to you, I'm like, I understand that you can talk a lot and you can tell me what other people have considered socialism to be, but under your current definitions, for instance,
No,
the
I gave you
democratic...
my
Hold on,
definition.
no, you haven't given me your definition. You've told me what other thinkers and what other countries in the past...
Why do I think that Stephen wasn't listening very closely when he gave the 3 strains? Because Stephen doesn't know which of those strains the professor believes in. And he's saying things like, you haven't given me your definition, when the professor already has. This comment is not taking into account his thoughts on socialism, really, though this will become more clear in a bit. He must have missed Wolf say he believes in strain 3 twice. And then he assigns a definition to him regardless.
Your definition is not what Portugal does, or it's not what the Portuguese Socialist or Communist Party is. You're giving me what other people or other thinkers have thought what socialism is. Because under your current definition, number one, the Democratic Party in the United States would be considered a socialist party because they're in favor of heavy government intervention in terms of climate change or healthcare.
You're assigning number 1 to him as his definition when it seemed that tonally he didn't really believe in number 1. He says that number 1 people have given up on the idea, kind of. He said explicitly that number 3 was his definition. So this whole little bit here is just incredibly rough for me. For me, having noticed this issue in my first viewing, this really sounds like nails on a chalkboard. It was rough seeing Stephen continue having not noticed this issue. And I know that, remember, and I gave disclaimers at the beginning, in the moment it could be very, very hard. In the moment things like this happen. What bothers me more is that other people didn't notice this, and I'm glad that it can be more clear in the line by line that the professor explicitly gave his definition as strain number 3, and we're assigning a completely different definition to him.
Would you agree that the Democratic Party in the United States of America is a socialist party? Or if they rebranded themselves... Okay, so it's clear then that the naming mechanism alone isn't enough for you, because the Nazi Party obviously called themselves socialists. I don't think many people, me included, would consider themselves socialist.
This is just so rough, given that he gave you an explicit definition already. This is the way that Stephen talks with other people when he feels like they're not giving him answers. And there are a lot of times where he's correct about this, but he's just like using this cookie cutter way of talking on somebody that already gave him this answer. So to me, this was a really gnarly moment for Stephen at like a logical level. Rhetorically, he passes because you guys didn't notice this at all. So rhetorically, you're in the clear. Good job. It's just that logically, this really, really bothers me. And if you hear anybody that is on Wolf's side that mentions this point, just know that they're not fucking crazy. I'm okay with you saying that the dude is long-winded or this or that or the other thing, the gazillion things that he did do wrong. I'm okay with you mentioning the gazillion things that Stephen did right and wrong. But I really don't want to hear shit that's not true, or I don't want you to argue against people that are in the right. So just know that that Wolf gave him a definition here and he completely missed it. Wolf at no point says that strain 1 and 2 aren't socialist, just that they aren't his preferred brands of socialism. In the same way, corporate capitalism isn't my preferred strain, but it still is capitalist. So when Destiny asks, are the Democrats socialists, and Wolf can't say they are, to me this comes off badly. Yes, I totally agree. If Stephen would have challenged him by saying, it would seem that strain 1 would be represented by the policies that the modern Democrats are putting forward in the direction that that party is heading, that would have been a POG argument that actually takes into account the strains and the definitions. Things like this, I think, are important to keep track of, especially since this is already several steps removed from the 5-question thing, you know? At this moment where we focus on the definition 1 and then we assign that definition to this dude, this whole section, this is why I'm shitting on this section, is because not only does it get us away from the 5 questions, which it would seem was Destiny's focus, but it also isn't played out properly at a logical level. He wasn't listening to the dude. He assigns things to the dude that are not correct. And, you know, that's just really, really, really bad. So when people in the chat are trying to figure out some convoluted way where we can go after definition number 1 and you know, make the derailing not a bad thing, like, it's not just that we derailed and we weren't focusing on getting our 5 questions answered, it's that we also completely misplayed this area. And I wonder if this misplaying the area is indicative of the fact that he missed the definition part, or that he wasn't fully listening, you know, and that's a problem in and of itself. So just be careful about that moving forward, Stephen. If you know that you're tuning somebody out or you're getting upset and stuff, try to keep it in check and like think more about it, you know, because if it plays out like this, then it becomes more clear to the audience that something like this happens. It's almost like when people start to notice that like Vosh is lying, you know, it's like an insidious little problem that might slip underneath people if they're not listening for it. But at a line by line level, it becomes really apparent. So just be careful with that, you know?
So I'm just trying to figure out what can you tell me, what is capitalism to you? What does it mean when an economy or a society is a capitalist economy? What does that mean to you?
So now we're going on to capitalism. We got very little done with strain number 1. We didn't get anything done with the definition thing about stating they are a thing versus whatever. We've completely moved off of it. We're now going to focus on capitalism and markets for the rest of this section. All of that part about this number 1 thing was for naught. The only good thing that came out of that was a focus on how markets a capitalist economy does not make. Markets exist in other kinds of economies, in that the existence of a market does not make something capitalist.
I gave you 3 definitions of socialism. I told you they weren't the only 3. This is a debate that's been going on inside socialism, and it's perfectly reasonable for me to give you those 3. It might be nice for you if there was one you could cling to, but that's not the way it is. The tradition is too big, too broad, too global for there to be one definition, as there is in most interesting things in the world, and certainly in many large organizations and large traditions. I did give you my own. My own is focused on the transformation of the workplace. It's more interested in the micro transformation than in the macro ones, and particularly skeptical about the power of the government as having had some bad consequences. I want to learn from these early efforts to build socialism so that the future revolts against capitalism will have a better outcome than the ones that we've already had.
What is capitalism?
Let me finish. They achieved many things we want to hold on to, and they made some mistakes we want to avoid. And that's exactly what it means to learn from the past. Now let me address the question of capitalism.
Now, people meme on him for shit like this.
All right, you said all this stuff. Now I'm going to talk about the actual question.
My advice to him to fix this is not necessarily to not give the diatribes. It's to change the order in which these things happen. Maybe you should answer the question before you like refute points, you know? People have a limited attention span and they are not going to remember all the shit that you said by the end. So let's try to focus on what is important.
Here's what capitalism is not distinguished by, and therefore is not useful as a definition. Markets. Slavery has markets. It's a different economic system. Feudalism had markets for much of its history. That's not a definition of capitalism that's unique. Capitalism doesn't uniquely have markets. That's silly.
The reason why we're using slavery, feudalism, and whatever is to make the point that markets do not make a capitalist thing, that markets existed in other forms throughout history. So we're kind of understanding why if something has a market, that doesn't necessarily make it capitalist, right? If markets can exist in slavery, feudalism, etc., markets could also exist in a socialist system. It's probably more about the proportion, right? If everything is dominated by capitalistic markets, I would be on Stephen's team to say it's tough to call that a socialist country when markets seem to be the main, like, economic, function there. If it was actually worded that way, Wolf might even agree with that.
Free or controlled markets, which is all we've ever had in the world, the controlled kind, are as old as Plato and Aristotle, who argued over markets. By the way, both of them opposed markets and thought they were socially destructive institutions, just for as a footnote you might be interested in. But capitalism is unique in one way. It's not a system that's unique in its markets. It's not a system that's unique in its quote-unquote free enterprises. Those are as old as Methuselah. But here is what's unique. Earlier systems, for example, slavery, organized the production of goods and services around a dichotomy, a slave and a master. The master owned all the equipment, all the means of production, and including the worker himself and herself. He owned them. And that was a very unusual way of organizing things, but it existed for a long time. Did it have markets? Often. Did it sometimes exist without markets? You bet. Then there's feudalism, radically different. No master, no slave. Nobody's anybody else's property. But you know how that works? You have a small group of lords at the top and a mass of serfs at the bottom. And the way the system works is that the serfs swear loyalty to the lord, and the lord in return to the serf. And the whole thing is sanctified in Europe by the Catholic Church.
Okay,
let me finish.
I can personally understand the impatience, but it came literally as he was starting on capitalism. Wolf has a rhetorical failure with these long-winded explanations, likely coming from how he's used to speaking, both as a professor and an academic. Academics can be used to nuance and analogies to draw historical progression or provide contrast to their ideas. Mixed with how slow he is compared to Destiny, though, it makes it seem like he doesn't answer questions, especially if the audience doesn't remain patient and listen for their answer at the end. If the audience isn't trying to understand how what he's saying now relates to the answer at the end, right? Which is a huge part. This context is actually relevant to the point that he's making. My advice to him is to answer at the beginning, then get as much of his context/explanation as he can at the end. How about we give your explicit answer that everybody is looking for at the beginning, maybe even in a way that surprises them, that shocks them, that makes them want an explanation, and then give your explanation, right?
Then comes capitalism. It's not a master and a slave. It's not a lord and a serf. It's a completely different arrangement. It's a contract. It's an employer and an employee. They don't swear anything to one another, and neither owns the other one. But they enter into a contract in which the employer says, I'm going to give you a wage at the end of the week. You're going to give me your brains and muscles for these hours of these days, and that's a deal we're going to make, and that's how we organize production. That's the distinction of capitalism.
No,
that's
it's
what
not.
I mean by
capitalism.
capitalism.
You haven't given me a definition of capitalism at all. You've told me a bunch of things that capitalism isn't, and then you've given me a bunch of random collected facts of history, but none of these things
Not at all.
are... Wait, hold,
No,
absolutely.
I didn't do that.
No, you missed the whole point of the whole goddamn thing. They're not random collective facts of history. They are parallels. They're parallel systems that have existed, and all of the parts are parallel. There are two main groups in a hierarchy that have a relationship between one another, a relationship that is often sealed by a pact, a contract, or institutions. He misses the whole point of this whole thing, and a lot of audience members do too. And I don't know if it's because he interrupted him and said this, or if people honestly had the problem with remembering all the points that the professor is giving, or if they weren't listening. I don't know what it is. This is a completely unfair statement to make at a pure nuts and bolts level when we're looking line by line. To say that he's given you a bunch of random collective facts of history, it's not a bunch of random collective facts of history. They're very particularly selected because they're meant to be parallels to the system, to explain to you that there are different moving pieces here, there are different variables, which we've seen over time in different systems, and here is how capitalism plugs into that formula that we've seen repeated time and time again. If he would have said, Professor, I can understand if you just give me the definition like you did there. There's no need to have all these other explanations. I think we would save a lot of time if you don't do that. I would have said that's fair and that's a Chad fucking take. Yeah, we don't need all of that, Professor. You can just give us the answer. We're not idiots, right? But he doesn't do that. He says something that's completely untrue. And that's the problem that I have with it.
When we talk about worker-managed firms or worker-managed co-ops, these things exist under capitalism. What do you, okay, well, what are you saying then? Can I, hold on, real quick, I'm sorry. Can I get an explicit answer that is answered within the last 50 years without going back into feudalism or what the Pope said or the schism of the Catholic Church? I want to know very concretely, without moralizing or loading anything, or without talking about something that happened in 1850, what is capitalism to you? Can you just tell me or explain what capitalism is? Because it sounds like, go ahead.
Any definition of anything is a process of separating it from that which it is not. That's all any definition ever was.
But we don't typically give definitions by naming every single thing that something's not.
Okay, let him answer. Let him answer this.
Dog is you differentiate it from a cat. Otherwise, there's no way to do it.
And it was at that moment the professor fucked up. Cool for Zen, bad for this argument. When the criticism is that you are not answering questions or meandering, this cryptic sort of answer is not going to land well. Major rhetorical failure for Wolff. He could have easily just reiterated strain 3 and explained his later point he makes about aiming for the ratio of worker run to independent places to be in favor of the former. Beating around the bush and taking a wild answer is a huge problem for him. It might be fun for his lectures, but it is a bad matchup for Destiny. Nobody defines dogs by them not being cats. You're out of your mind, Professor. I'm so sorry. And if I'm going to roast Steven for missing your definitions, I got to roast you for some shit like this. Yeah, I didn't like that Booksmarts guy, but he's right here. I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah, he did fuck up that line. Yeah.
That's
to
not even true.
differentiate and to give a definition of capitalism, you have to distinguish it from that which it is not. Those other systems didn't use an employer-employee relationship. That is the core distinguishing quality of capitalism. Slavery doesn't have that. Feudalism doesn't have that. And I never used the phrase worker management. Managers are not what we're talking about. Owning and operating. If you want to use a word, it's workers as their own boss, workers as their own board of directors.
I know it is pedantic in hindsight, but at the time, maybe he thought it was important. In any case, it's adding to this sort of optical debt he's accruing and hurting his case here. Plus, it could have led to a whole tangent on that topic, which would have been awful. If you would have triggered Steven here, then you guys start talking about fucking worker management versus workers versus executives. You're building up some optical debt here, Professor, and it's really not helping you.
If you like, you can use the colloquialism in the United States that has existed throughout our history. A worker co-op, a cooperative, one worker, one vote. All decisions, majority vote. That doesn't exist in capitalism. That exists in a different relationship among the people at the workplace. Not slavery, not feudalism, and not employer-employee, because those are different people in each of those systems. Worker co-op, that's no longer the case. That's why it's a radically different socialist system, unlike any of the others.
How can you say that that's unlike any of the others when co-ops can exist today under capitalist economies?
Slavery can exist and did.
You're not answering my question. I don't want you to give the negative of everything I'm saying. You're saying today that this is a unique thing that exists.
There's never been a problem in any society of which we have historical record for different class structures, different systems to coexist. You're asking me a question as if it were, is this possible? It's never been anything other than the norm.
But you're telling me that in your society, or I could be wrong, you can correct me.
Good little correction there from Steven that I personally appreciate. He didn't say what you're about to say. You completely assumed it, although it's completely reasonable to do. Be very careful with that, because you assumed some dumb shit at the beginning about Marx and stuff that he completely roasts you for. So I like that you learned, and you're trying to be much more careful, because you know he can go on a whole diatribe if you ascribe to him beliefs that are not his, especially if you say he explicitly said it when he didn't. Good little catch. I appreciate that from Steven here.
It sounds like in your society, you would exclusively like firms systems to be in the hands of workers, which would necessarily preclude...
Not at all.
Man, this exclusively, to use a phrase that Stephen likes to use, is carrying a lot of weight in this statement here. That's not really what he said earlier at all when he explained strain 3. Further, it contradicts even his most recent explanation with the different systems and the mention of markets existing under multiple systems. So to explain that more, remember when we were talking about markets could have existed under slavery, under feudalism, under all of these, like markets don't make that. And plus, slavery can exist under feudalism, right? There could be a slave relationship thing going on that has a pact that's supported under a feudalistic system where there are also lords and serfs. These things can coexist at the same time. That's what we see when he's pointing out the fact that there are co-ops that exist under capitalism at the moment. These things can be in different ratios, you know, and that's totally fine. That's what we see all throughout history. The world doesn't work like a changing gearbox where it's like 0 or 100, right? Otherwise it starts grinding. It even ignores the logic laid out in the line prior. Destiny is tuning out some very important parts of Wolff's explanations, whether intentionally or not. In my opinion, watching for the first time, this repeating issue was glaring. I gave Wolff the advice to be more brief, but Destiny may need to listen better or be more flexible in what answers he accepts, perhaps even taking time to process the statements, the way that Dr. K does, although he would never do that. Continuing to hound away on one line of questioning, looking for a very particular answer, will not be satisfying against Wolff, as has been demonstrated through this talk. Again, Wolff is drawing a clear picture, in my opinion. Destiny just seems to reject its formatting, whilst missing the message entirely and taking nothing of benefit from it, which rubs off on the audience to his advantage, right? You guys ended up siding with Destiny and thinking none of that was important, even if it totally was when you look at it line by line. So I'm shitting on Destiny here for doing this because he does it sometimes or it doesn't work out for him. But in this particular instance, it was a rhetorical win. The audience agreed. The dude was too long-winded. These explanations didn't click with them either. So him, you know, missing parts of the picture and not doing his best job as an interlocutor is fine because the audience couldn't keep up either. However, Vosh does this as well. And sometimes that hurts your baby boy Destiny in conversations with Vosh, right? So this cuts both ways. It's very frustrating when you're a part of the opposing community to see this happen, right? If we start leaning into that as a strategy, the way that Vosh did, for instance, in the call that I looked at between him and Steven a while ago, you're like literally cooking, like lying and being deceptive into your tactics, and that I think is not what Stephen wants to do. So just be careful about this moving forward would be my advice.
So I've never written that. I've never said it. You're just attributing things to me.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying very hard to understand what you're saying, but the problem is your answers are very long-winded and you're not really answering my question.
I know you're trying very hard, but I think you should try differently. Be more flexible. Don't fucking look for just this very, very specific, you know, wavelength of answer and expect that it's going to fit in that all the time. Try to widen out and be accepting of answers that don't fit into the format you're expecting. You're very long-winded. Sure, I will give that to you. 110%. He is long-winded and it's a huge problem. And not really answering my questions. That's not true. Thus far in the debate, Wolff has answered every single one of your questions. I would argue that he gave you even more of an answer than you wanted. He was long-winded. He gave history lessons. He explained books and shit that he's getting the ideas from. If anything, he answered much more than he needed to, but he is most certainly not snaking out of answering them. He is most certainly not really answering questions like, no, this isn't true. He gives you explicit answers.
So am I to understand then that you are in favor of a society where workers have the option to vote on and have control over the workplace, but there's also room for private investment and the government intervenes in things like healthcare or education? Is this like the type of society you're aiming for?
My guess would be that the transition from capitalism to what I'm talking about would have long periods of time, typically, where these different class structures, these different systems coexist with one another.
Okay, that's what we have today.
No, you don't have it in anything like the way I want it.
Well, how do you want it? What's different from your vision than what we have today?
Well, what we have today is predominantly capitalist with smatterings of the other. I'm interested in having predominantly socialist with smatterings of the other.
If you ever do this again, Professor, do it like this. Give explicit, short, easy to understand answers. Don't have more than 3 pieces to it. This is perfect. From here on out, I don't take any more notes. The only reason that I prepare a line by line nowadays is basically for when I think that people would disagree with me, or I think that people have a hard time understanding where I'm coming from, or if I think that people missed something. I think that the end of this conversation, I agree with the consensus, went very poorly for the professor. So I hope it's not frustrating to you guys that I don't have notes for it, but I kind of want to let that last part play out and just riff off of it.
Without disallowing private investment or disallowing individual owners, how do you get there?
Private investment is a completely different matter. You can have private investment and worker co-ops.
How?
It exists. What's the problem?
Why would I ever invest in a company without gaining some amount of equity in the company? They have no obligation to return to me any profit. I would never invest in a co-op.
Why would you invest in you invest in businesses in the United States?
Correct, because businesses.
For example, let me finish. Hoping, for example, for something called a capital gain.
Mm-hmm.
You hope that if you buy the shares and if the company does real well, you will be able to sell the shares at some future point to another investor at a higher price.
Correct.
If that company's growth is the product of its worker co-op organization, you're perfectly happy if you can make an investment that grows over time.
But in your world, those shares don't exist.
Give you an example. First of all, there exist where these kinds of enterprises exist in the world. So this is not a hypothetical.
Then they're not worker co-ops by definition.
Sure they are.
A worker okay, tell me, my definition might be incorrect, so you can correct me. My understanding is that what makes something a worker co-op, or what makes something employee-owned, is that the means of production or whatever firm you operate at is wholly owned and operated by the workers, meaning that when profits are generated by that company, they're returned to the workers, and when decisions are made about that company, those decisions are made by the workers. If that is the definition that we're going by, there is no room for private investment there.
Right, but that's the wrong definition and not the one that operates in the world.
I believe in strain number 3, we talked about how ownership could be by the government, by people, by private people, by the workers. I don't think Wolf ever cared about that. He didn't care if the government or private people owned the things. He cared about the operations being under control by the workers. So I think he doesn't mind if people actually buy equity in the company, that they have some kind of stake of ownership of the company. It's more so that they can have that equity. It's just they'll have no voting rights. I think that's what he meant there. So I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Definition of a worker co-op is that the workers make the key decisions. They are their own board of directors. They may make the decision democratically to raise capital for their business by selling shares. Of course they could do that. Those shares would not allow the people who own them to do the steps that they can in capitalism. They would not, for example, be able to dictate who's the board of directors, because the workers themselves are their own board of directors. But there's no problem with private investment. There never was.
And my question is why? No, I don't need an example. No example. We have this definition. Okay, I just want to hone in on this definition. Okay, my question is why would any individual ever invest in a company that doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors? So, for instance, in your world, if I were to buy 20% of a co-op, their workers tomorrow could say, you know what? We're all bored. We don't want to do this anymore. We're going to move on. We're shutting the business down. And now I've just completely lost out on my investment because they have no responsibility to me because I have non-controlling shares. If the only shares you're selling are non-controlling, why would any private investment ever come in knowing that that co-op never has an obligation to make a profit or return a dividend to the investors?
There's many companies listed on the stock exchange right now that pay no dividends to their investors here in the United States. It's a normal part of our
No, absolutely not. They might not pay.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about Capital Markets 101.
He's earned it, dude. He gets to be rhetorically mean here. I think he's completely warranted. He was timid in all of his interruptions and problems at the beginning. He's inviting phraseology like, I could be wrong, compared to how he normally is. 10 out of 10, dude. He does fine for everything up to this point, and we're getting into the back and forth that he wanted at the very beginning, and it seems like the professor may be incorrect about things in this section.
They might not pay a dividend, but
then you're badly misinformed.
I'm not bad. I promise you, the foundation of the stock market in the United States is a returning of capital to the people that are the ones doing the investment in companies. Now, it might be the case, as you correctly point out. Absolutely. It might be the case.
Really.
Yeah, really.
You're unaware.
Most
of the most dynamic companies in this country are selling stock to people to whom they have no responsibility, legal or otherwise, to give them a dividend ever.
Okay, Professor, do you believe that a dividend is the only way that you can return capital to shareholders?
That's not the point.
That absolutely is the point.
You made the point. What is the company responsible for? The company is responsible to run the company. They are not responsible to give money back, whether it's dividend, return of capital, or any other way, to the people who give them the money to buy shares. The people who give them the money are gambling. They hope that they can sell the shares for more, and they will sell the shares to anybody who can buy them. The company's not responsible to buy those shares. The company's not responsible for what price they can get. If they lose their shirt, tough luck. It's not an obligation or a responsible. That's the way the law of this country works for the stock market. And there's no problem in a worker co-op saying to investors, we're going to grow better than what you can get from a capitalist enterprise. So buying a share of our stock will give you a better shot to sell it at a higher price later. And I can give you examples.
Wait, I don't want examples. No. We don't need examples because
I'm going to give you an example of a company that did that, just so you can see why an investor would do it.
And this is why I think all of this meanness works at the very end. The professor has overused examples with these long-winded explanations that have resulted in complete optical failures. Because he's been able to do this, and nobody caught on to that smidgen of an issue that Destiny had before that I spent a bunch of time talking about, this works so well because Steven is in the seat with the audience. They all hate the examples. Pointing these things out, being snarky here actually works. It works in a way that it wouldn't have if the audience wasn't fully on his team, but they totally are. Even the socialists didn't think that Richard Wolff did well here. As long as he keeps saying things and being snarky in a way that lines up with how the chat feels, he's good to go.
You can make the theater of your hand on your
I'm not
face.
making
You can't do that, especially when the audience isn't on your team, because you're adding insult to injury here. He's face-palming because the audience at home is face-palming, and you're not even self-aware enough to see how you're doing in this debate.
The problem is you've said something that's just so on its face absurdly incorrect about the characterization of U.S. capital markets. Do you not agree that there exists a legally binding, the SEC literally regulates fiduciary responsibilities to investors? I don't like this trick you've pulled by making it sound like, let me finish, please, let me finish. Let me finish. You've made it sound as though I believe the only way to return capital to shareholders is through dividends. That's absolutely not the case. That's one reading of it. You can return it via stock buybacks. You can return it via increase in growth of a company.
You're not obligated to do any of that.
You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. Of course you do.
If you take my advice, I teach these courses.
You cannot pull the ethos card here, Professor. It just does not work for you. You are lacking critical information that he did a bunch of prep on his stream beforehand, and this audience is completely primed against you. It's like you found like a fucking oil fire on the ground, and you thought that you could put it out with your clothes, and you throw a shirt on it, and the shirt combusts. And then you're like, fuck it, dude, I got my lucky jacket. I got my fucking authority that I have as a professor. It works for me every fucking time. I'm going to throw it on the fire. And I was like, no, Professor, don't. That's so useful for other stuff, but I can tell you right now, it is not going to put out the fire, dude. It is not going to put out the fire. Don't put that on there, Professor. And he takes all of his authority as a fucking econ professor, and he throws it on the fire. What a bad time to appeal to authority there, because you've just poisoned any other ability you have to call back to that, because the audience is super duper convinced that you're wrong here.
If you read what fiduciary responsibility means, it's an abstract generalization. It can be easily demonstrated in thousands of legal cases that there is no obligation of any material sort that they return money to the people who invest in them. It is perfectly okay to run your business as you think it should best be done, short of committing fraud or illegal activity, and that would apply in any system. The investor is taking a chance buying your shares in the hopes of selling them at a higher price. It happens all the time, and it would be perfectly consistent with workers who run their own enterprises and are their own board of directors. That's not a problem. Never was. There's nothing inconsistent with private investment on the one hand and worker co-ops on the other. Now, if you have a worker co-op system, they might decide, because we have democracy now, that they don't want that they would like to be the owners as well as the board of directors of their own enterprise. That's possible. That would be one of the variations of worker co-op economic systems, just like we have variations of capitalist systems.
Can I ask you, so in a private business in the United States, if I invest my money in a business, a publicly traded business, if they were to cash out all of that money, just close the business down and run, you're telling me that in the United States, that company wouldn't be held liable for scamming its investors?
Absolutely. If that company had a good lawyer and showed that they made an honest effort to have a business and then it didn't work out and they closed it down, the investor would have absolutely no standing.
Exactly. You're right. But you used a word there, an honest effort, and it's doing all the heavy lifting in that statement. Of course.
This is what I show up for, dude. I like it when you're on top of it, dude. When you're on your A game. This is a good example of that. Hold on. You're completely correct, Professor. That's right. Shut the fuck up. I said you were correct. Because that statement right there, that one word is doing all the heavy lifting. Oh, I love it. It's so fucking good, dude.
You absolutely must show a court that you are making a good, this is part of your fiduciary responsibility. You are making a good faith effort to return money.
That's what the worker co-ops could easily do. We're making a good faith, honest effort to make a business. And that business requires us to do X, Y, and Z. And the private investor got nothing to do. That happens every day.
That's not what a worker co-op's maximizing for, though. A worker co-op, if by your definition, which is a democratically voted organization, is going to be trying to take into account what their members are voting for. They might not vote in the best interest of a shareholder. They might vote to do something completely different with the company.
That would be understood by the shareholder.
But that's my entire
point. By the way, only the most naive shareholder in the United States believes that the company's decisions are intended to do the best for the shareholder. I can show you 50,000 legal cases in which that's not the case, and which it is contested in the courts, and you could have that in a worker.
That's great, and I can show you the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, and the S&P 500. We could go to the UK and look at the FTSE 250, the FTSE 1, and I can show you histories of markets where companies do reliably over long periods of time return profits, whether in the form of dividends or the increase in your share price, to people that invest in those companies. I'm sure you can show me a lot of things that happen that are bad in capital markets where companies scam people, much as I can show you bad things that happen like famines under the USSR. But pointing out to a few bad actors does not clear up the problem of the fact that investing in a co-op where the workers have no obligation to return anything to an investor.
We're not talking about bad actors. You're inventing these things. We were talking about private investment and worker co-ops. You had made a statement that these somehow couldn't coexist. I'm explaining to you that there's not the slightest problem. You want to change the topic, that's very nice, but that's what the topic was. We weren't comparing goods and bad stories. We were explaining how and why private investment is not an either or in relationship to worker co-ops. One of the fastest growing industries in Spain is something called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It's a family of worker co-ops.
They're not even worker managed, though. I don't know. This isn't even a good.
It is the seventh largest corporation in Spain.
It's a federation of corporations.
Excuse me?
It's a federation of corporations, and it's not even worker managed. That's just worker owned, and they have all the same exploitative problems. They go to South America for labor. They rely on contract labor. Chomsky has criticized the Mondragon thing for existing in a capitalist framework forever. And even if this was your go-to killer example, the Mondragon Federation of Co-ops exists under a capitalist framework.
Could I finish, or do you need to tell me about the Mondragon Corporation?
I didn't mean to interrupt your lecture. I'm sorry. Continue.
Sure you did. Come on. Who you think you're kidding? The Mondragon Corporation has many parts. The biggest single part of it are a collection of worker co-ops. If this were the United States, we'd call it a holding company, which is a collection of subsidiaries that do a variety of things. It's very common in the United States, and it is very common in the world of worker co-ops to do that as well. The different divisions help each other. The co-ops support one another. That's how the Mondragon Corporation went from 6 people in 1956 to over 100,000 now. Most of the people in the Mondragon Corporation function within their members, about 200 companies, each of which has workers, one person, one vote, making democratic decisions. This company has been extraordinarily successful. It has outcompeted its capitalist competitors. That's how it became so large. That's how it becomes so successful as it has been. It has rules. It maximizes, because you raised that before, a variety of objectives. It is not focused exclusively on profits. The notion that profit is the bottom line is the very convenient economic nonsense, because profits go into the hands of the capitalists at the top. And of course, they want the company to maximize profits because that's what they get. They don't maximize wages because that's what they don't get. Other people get that. If the other people ran the business, its objectives would not just be profit, but the well-being of those workers, the community's well-being, a whole lot of other objectives to maximize. And you'd have to choose among them. You wouldn't have the essential profit maximizing, which we teach in economics, without explaining to our students that by maximizing profit, the whole company's life is devoted to maximizing the return of a very small number of people within it. Okay, this is what is changed in a worker co-op. That's why it's so different from capitalism. Its decisions, investment, growth, distribution of income, all the big decisions would be made with a different set of objectives, because a different set of people with different interests are making those decisions. For a society like ours that blabbers on about democracy, you'd think this was the most attractive possible way to proceed, because it democratizes the economy by democratizing the enterprises at the core of that economy. Instead, we live in a society which pretends that you can have political democracy, even though in economics you have an autocracy, a tiny aristocracy running each enterprise, doing what it wants, maximizing the part of the output it gets, namely the profit. And therefore, we get surprised that our political democracy doesn't work real well. Hello, that's because it's trying to sit on top of an economic system that is the opposite of democratic. The proposal of socialists is a proposal to extend democracy from the political realm to the economic realm. Why that is frightening to people who otherwise say they favor democracy, I find amazing.
I find it equally amazing that throughout this entire monologue, all you're advocating for are liberal markets with a little bit more government intervention. If you want to talk about Mondragon, absolutely. If you want to talk about Mondragon, we can talk about Mondragon until we're both blue in the face. One, it's not worker managed, okay? It is just worker owned. A lot of the management that comes within a lot of the Mondragon Federation come from other workers, but they do not vote on all of their policies or productions. That is absolutely not true. Number two, Mondragon does run itself for profit. That's why if you only change the means of production and not the mode of production, you are still producing commodities for a profit. Now, it happens in this case that the profit is going to the workers, but it still absolutely runs for a profit. That's why socialists point to it and say, look at how successful it is. Part of the reason why it's successful is the amazing revenues and profits that it returns to its workers that are generated. And then number three, Mondragon, in order to continue growing, one of the problems that Mondragon has started to face recently, and it's one of the reasons why it's criticized by people like Chomsky, is because it's had to continue to acquire more and more workers that do not get controlling shares, that don't have the ability to vote on what's going on. Mondragon also trades across markets, including going to places like South America and trading with exploited workers. So I don't think that Mondragon exists under a capitalist mode of economics. Like, Mondragon exists and interacts with other people within a capitalist economy, which I think is good. If Mondragon works and succeeds, that's awesome. I think it's cool. I like to see alternative types of businesses succeed. But I don't understand how You can talk about the successes of Mondragon and then say that, like, well, this is an example of the failures of capitalism when Mondragon exists and thrives right now under a capitalist framework, interacting with so many other capitalist sections of the economy and so many other capitalist countries in the world. My problem is that by moving more towards what you want, you would use government policy to necessarily disallow the types of private ownership or private investment that have been so important with other types of inventions or creations around the world. You can keep saying that I'm making stuff up, but at the end of the day, the problem that we're
Let me explain.
You don't help it when you explain, though, Professor. Like, that's the problem. He sounds so dejected there. He's like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. None of your explanations are very good. They're all super long-winded. Nobody remembers what you were talking about. You hide your answers in all of them. Like, I'm sorry, dude. Explaining is not the solution here. If you ever deal with somebody like Destiny or Vaush or any of these people ever again, I feel like you're almost doing a disservice to the ideology and the materials that you want to promote. You can't just copy paste what you're doing in your lectures and hope that it works. It really doesn't. The
problem we're having is the definition of socialism, and I notice that this is like it seems to be a key problem with people that call themselves socialists, is your definition of socialism is so amorphous and morphing at any particular point in time. I still don't really have...
Well, you seem to be having trouble with it, but that doesn't make it amorphous.
It absolutely is amorphous. Even your definition of capitalism is absolutely amorphous, where I hear ruling...
Well, you're just not familiar with it.
I'm absolutely familiar with it. I absolutely am able to... If you would like to ask me for my definitions of any of these things, I would be glad to explain it. And you can tell me, you can correct me, Professor, if you think I'm incorrect in my understanding of things. But I believe that when I ask you to tell me, like, what is capitalism, what is socialism, and it feels like I'm listening to Trebek, read off the board in Jeopardy, I feel like that's damaging to the position that you're trying to explain more so than me ask you the question.
So I'll be quite honest. I listened to the first 45 minutes of this over and over and over again to take all the notes. I did not listen to this section more than twice. That's a fucking roast, dude. Jesus Christ.
Any worker co-op that forms now has to exist within a framework of a society that's organized differently. That's exactly the way it was when capitalism emerged out of feudalism. The early capitalist enterprises, towns, villages, had to exist within a feudal framework. They had to come to terms with that. Some of them were able to do it. Others of them disappeared or were overthrown by feudalism until they got big enough and strong enough and learned from the mistakes of early experiments in capitalism how to set up a system that would be what it now is, the global system. I expect the socialists to kind of replicate that experience. Russia was an experiment. China's a better one. Cuba, Vietnam, and so on. They make efforts. They're learning what you do, what you don't do, what you replicate, what you avoid, and they will get eventually to the scale and sense of how to do it on a more global scale. That's how feudalism happened. That's how slavery happened. That's how capitalism happened. And it's reasonable to expect that's how socialism will happen. There is no simple definition of socialism that would be, to use your words, correct. No agency gives you out a license. This is correct. That one isn't. A tradition as lively, as global as socialism is always going to have different interpretations, different definitions that argue with one another. That's healthy, that's normal, there's nothing fuzzy or amorphous about it.
It is amorphous, isn't it? Amorphous, without a clearly defined shape or form, lacking a clear structure or focus. Yeah, I don't know, bro. It sounds amorphous to me.
The idea that you can have one definition is an authoritative and authoritarian notion that there isn't debate and contestation when there always is. My job was to give you three of the major definitions of socialism that contest in the world today, that are widely accepted. By everybody? Of course not. But those are the ones that are around, and it's reasonable to talk about the tradition in that way. Mondragon is, let me finish. Mondragon is an experiment, a very successful one. You can, if you like, attribute everything to capitalism that happens that's good and attribute everything bad that happens to the absence of capitalism.
I'm not doing
this
that. I've
isn't
never
very
done that.
Interesting. And that's really not very interesting. And I'm not going to get into that. I will tell you
That's good, because
that
nobody
there are
brought
some
it up.
remarkable things that Mondragon has done. Along the way, the majority of its workers voted the following rule. The best paid person in Mondragon cannot get more than 8 to 9 times what the least best paid person is.
That's
This
not
was an
true.
attempt to I've been there.
Okay.
I've watched it.
It's just not.
So like a Lauren Southern argument. I was on the boats. I was at the wall, bruh. You can't tell me. You can't tell me. I was there.
So you're telling me that of all the
It is
employees
true.
in Mondragon, the highest paid employee.
That was a decision. That was a decision made by a large number of the worker co-ops that make that kind
So
of
you're telling me
decision.
that the highest paid employee in Mondragon, it has a ratio of what they're.
Let me finish. In many of the component co-ops.
There you-
'cause
okay,
it's
that's
a
correct,
Holding
yes.
company. It's a holding company of many, many co-ops. In many, many of those co-ops, I can't speak for everyone, this was a common rule.
While Wolf clearly had a rhetorical failing in terms of the entire debate, I do think that there were some logical bits that people are misunderstanding from the debate. And I don't think it's fair to say, for instance, that he's not answering questions or things like this when he is actually mixing in explicit answers in a lot of his really long-winded responses. Destiny kept his cool for a lot of this. I understand that he was rude and snarky at the end, but in my opinion, it was completely warranted, especially since the things that he was being snarky about are things where he is actually seeming to be correct. Like when he's making criticisms about the nature of that company and how Wolf was kind of putting a spin on something that almost made it incorrect. He worked hard to complete points early. So stopping Wolf from interrupting him very early is good. I liked that. Now, it does kind of tonally conflict with what he asked for, which is that they do a back and forth and not do monologues. But I like that. I think he handled like interruptions and stuff pretty well, especially later on. Even when he let Wolf interrupt him, he appealed to the audience in a way that I really enjoy. It's something we see Vosh do. It's something, hell, we saw Mel do. Being aware of how interruptions can be used to make you look better depending on how you position yourself and what you say in response to those is super duper valuable. And he does that here when he's like,
I didn't mean to interrupt your lecture. I'm sorry. Continue.
or shit like that. Those are very, very good lines for him, and they demonstrate that he is starting to tune in to how the audience is going to perceive things and how he can leave breadcrumbs for that. Not to say he didn't always do that before, but it's something I see a lot more of in this debate, and I appreciate. He did a better job than usual at keeping the tone of his slights and quips to a level at or below his interlocutor, which kind of gets back to, finding benefit in these interruptions. Now, what was bad? He took a narrow and often inflexible approach to questions, answers, and definitions. Everybody has expectations in terms of what they want in an answer to a question. However, what I see in Debate Bro people, whether it's Dario or Demon Mama or Steven, is that we often have an inflexible approach to those. If an answer doesn't fit neatly into the, 3 responses we were expecting from that person, we get upset. We think they're using filler. We think they're snaking out of things. Rather than taking a step back and looking at how you could use that answer to move the conversation forward, you throw your hands up and say, that wasn't an answer to my question. You're not answering my question. And I think that oftentimes the people that get into a habit of doing that miss opportunities to keep the conversation moving forward and miss opportunities where they could be flexible and work with those definitions and maybe have a conversation they didn't anticipate to, have. Or maybe this person had ideas or beliefs that don't conform to what you expected from them. And when you add into that a bias against lefties, for example, that Stephen clearly has, I think that this can often taint his conversations with those people and leads him to be more rude about answers than he probably ought to be. Rather than continuing on interesting or progressive topics, he opted to focus on areas that stalled the conversation. We see this in the very beginning with the 3 strains of socialism and choosing to focus on strain number 1. failed to emphasize his 5 questions early on, and without repeating them, they become impossible to recall for the audience. I don't think anybody could read back to me what the 5 questions are. As a matter of fact, even watching it and playing it back, I'm the guy that watches Destiny at 3.5x. I had to put it at 1 and keep rewinding to get all 5 of those questions. And the fact that he never repeated what those actual questions were and just referred to the 5 questions that he had said in his intro, I think was a failure. Beyond that, if he was going to take up that little chunk of his intro with the 5 questions, I was saddened to see that he didn't focus on those as an objective for the conversation. And I would be even more dissatisfied if I heard that he characterized this conversation as somebody, again, failing to answer his 5 questions when he made no discernible effort to actually answer those 5 questions over the course of the debate, by not referring back to them, by not actually going back and explaining what they were or repeating them. But you're going to see that these are not nearly as bad as Wolf. So let's go with the good. I only have 2. Invites the nuance to be expected of a professor, even if it comes at a rhetorical cost. As somebody who used to work with professors a lot, used to work with educated people a lot, I personally have a liking for that kind of thing. I may be biased here, but I appreciate nuance. I appreciate when you give me an answer that I didn't expect, because it's coming from a knowledge base the size of which I cannot comprehend. They have spent years and years researching something to the extent that there's no way I could match it. There's no way I could put in a similar amount of time. I simply can't on every topic. And I think the answers that they come up with and what they choose to distill from that is super valuable, whether I agree with it or disagree with it. Unfortunately, it works to his detriment because he's also long-winded and talks very slowly. So you mix that with the tone of being super aggressive and kind of shitty to Destiny, and we have an unpalatable cake, okay? We have an unpalatable cupcake here. Exposed others to his deeper thinking on capitalism, socialism, and their relation to the workers of the world. This is something that I really liked. I liked hearing that there was a third version of this that focuses and emphasizes the daily working life of the people out there, of the people that need to work 8 hours a day, of the people that represent the majority of the population showing up and doing their 9 to 5 every day. I liked it so much that I'll probably go and watch more of him just to kind of hear more on that topic, because I don't feel that it was fleshed out, you know? And that's partly on Steven, but it's also partly on Wolf. I don't agree that the onus was on Wolf to focus on Strain 3 throughout the entire debate, as a chatter had mentioned earlier in the first 20 minutes. But I would say that, you know, that a lot was lost there. He certainly could have done that, and I think it would have made for a better conversation per what I was interested in. Let's go into the bad here. Oh boy. He was long-winded to the point of making it difficult for both his interlocutor and the audience to see his point in answers. Case in point, how you guys were responding at the very beginning of this review. This isn't to say he doesn't answer questions, which is something I'm hearing a lot and is simply untrue. He actually gives explicit answers that a lot of people seem to have missed while watching live. He came out swinging at Destiny and turned the debate hostile, which didn't work to his advantage right out of the gate. His tone throughout the debate is rougher than Destiny's, which to the Twitch community can offer a really stark contrast, right? When Destiny actually comes off way better than this educated professor dude, you know, it looks really bad. And I think everything from the memes to the commentary around this debate reflects that, right? The structure of his answers obscures what Destiny and the audience are looking for. So while I will say that the debate bros need to work on not expecting explicit answers like in the form that they exactly want it, I will say that you are not helping when you realize that the person sitting in front of you is looking for such answers. It doesn't help to say things like,
It might be nice for you if there was one you could cling to, but that's not the way it is.
yeah, but you can work harder, right? This is a two-way street, and you could choose to focus on single definitions that'll be more helpful to the conversation than constantly zooming out for thousands of years, and including everything from feudalism to early slave trade markets, right? Like, that was unnecessary. You don't need to do that. The moment that you realize that the person sitting across from you is looking for those explicit kind of like two-head answers, give the two-head answers. Don't give five-head explanations, because they're simply not landing, and that was clear from the get-go. The structure of his answers obscures, yeah, okay, I read that, seems more focused on giving lectures and explanations of his ideas and histories more so than engaging with Stephen's questions and statements. He wants to give enough teasers about information and about contradictory narratives that people will go and look on their own, and they may go and look at his lectures in specific to understand better what he's talking about. And he only needs it to be like a little bit, he needs to get some curiosity out of people, and then they'll go and watch all of his stuff. That seemed to me to be what his objective was here, because he certainly failed at the debate. This comes off bad tonally to the audience, as it seems that he treats Destiny as undereducated or spends too much time on these explanations. I think that goes without saying. Destiny is saying that 2021 is his year of rhetoric. And even if I criticize him here, just know that at the end of the day, I'm really proud of him for choosing to take that aspect of his debates more seriously and to actively work on fixing that and improving it. It's not lost on me that that's something that he's working on and he's gotten a lot better at. And I fucking just said it, dude.